Episodes of the Green Corn Rebellion Show are sponsored by Oklahoma Progress Now. Oklahoma Progress Now is a 501c4 organization focused on building progressive power in Oklahoma. Their primary efforts are on developing progressive content for a 21st century audience, coalition, and capacity building across progressive organizations and causes, and working to see elected leaders who are more responsive to their constituents and the needs of the many. Areas of focus include progressive messaging and communications, coalition building and resource sharing, and focused progressive policy goals. You can check out their Twitch live streams, and they go live on Facebook on at noon, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Please support this organization. It's a really great organization. It's just getting started here in Oklahoma. Thank you. Now enjoy the rest of the video. Start this off. So, hello, this is the Green Corn Rebellion Show, and today I'm here with Matt Bender, who is the host of the Doomed podcast and is a former contributor to the Majority Report. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. So first question I have here is, where are you from and where did you grow up at?
Ah, well, it all started a long time. No, I'm from, Queens, New York, and that's where I've been my entire life, all 33 years.
Oh, okay. You're a lot younger than I thought you were.
Really?
Not that much younger, but you're young.
Ah,
I was
it's
thinking,
interesting because I'll be honest, that's the first I've ever heard that, to be quite
really?
honest.
I was
Usually
assuming
people,
I was assuming you were more like 36 or so, maybe. More like mid,
yeah,
not really 30s. So,
yeah. I gotta say, everyone usually thinks I'm about, I don't know, I used to like not too long ago. It was like, you sure you could see this R-rated movie? Can I see your card? But I would say the past, like, since I hit 30, it's been more like, oh, you just graduated college, right? You're in your early 20s. No, I mean, I wish, but no.
yeah, that's kind of where I'm at now is the R-rated movies thing. Like I only go to the same movie theaters here in my hometown. So these people kind of know me, but occasionally they're still like, "Oh, well, we have to ask just because that's our
Right.
job." I'm like, "Sure it is. You've seen me come through here and see literally every movie that's in here this week." But you're
Well,
still asking. Yeah, go ahead.
not to turn your own show around against you, but how old are you and where are you from?
I'm 22 and I am from Shawnee, Oklahoma, born and raised. I was born in the same hospital. No, no, no. Let me rephrase it. Brad Pitt was born in the same hospital that I was born in.
Ah,
So
see,
yeah.
now I get the age thing. If you're, when I'm in my, I don't know, late 20s, early 30s, not too long ago, but long enough. Most people I'm talking to are in a general range where, they're not that much younger than me.
Hmm.
But now it's getting to the point where I'm getting older and, there's more people within that range of adults yet much younger than me. And so they probably look at me and think, "Oh, look at that old man over there. Look at that. He's got kids. I see a gray hair. He must be 55 years old." Yeah, no, I
Oh
get it
no.
now.
I wouldn't assume that. Like I've like even when I was like a teenager, I never looked at people in their 30s and thought that they were old. But that's probably because my parents are like way older than most people's parents. Like my parents are 58. So whenever I was growing up, my parents were like in their 40s and 50s, and everyone else's parents were in their like 30s and like early 40s. So for my whole perception of age is like warped compared to some people's. Like some people would look at you and think like, "Oh, that person's definitely up there in age," and to me, I'm just like, "No, it's just another young person."
Your
Like,
parents are in their late 50s now, you said?
yes, yes.
That's about the same for me. My parents are now in their late 60s. So when I was your age, they were in their
Yeah.
late 50s. But I'm the opposite. When I was younger, I would see anyone who was, I don't know, 20 plus and be like, now that's an adult. That's an old man. That's an old man. I
Yeah,
mean,
it is.
even when, I was, junior high or whatever, I would look at like high school kids just a few years older and be like, wow, look how grown up they are. Look how old they are. And then you enter high school and you even not even just yourself, just you look around at the people, your classmates, and you're like, why do we all look so young when the people who were in high school when I was like younger looked like old men and women? Like,
Hmm. See,
I don't know.
I have that now where like I look at like I substitute teach now. So I go back and I see like junior high kids and I'm like, there's no way I looked that young when I was that old. Like I did not look that young when I was 11. And then I look back at my pictures and I'm like, okay, maybe I did, but I don't
Right.
know. It felt like I looked older. Felt like all of us looked older back then, but so yeah, I kind of have the inverse thought of that. I look at high school kids now and I'm like, there's no way I looked that young when I was in high school. They're like, and then people will say, no, you look that young now. Like,
Right. Right.
but yeah,
Well, just the clock keeps ticking and time goes on and we just get older and I guess it'll always be like that in terms of us looking at people from, well, not the thing we were just talking about where it comes to, no one's ever gonna look much older than us, I guess now. Well, we pretty much know a general age range, but I mean
yeah,
the young people will always look at the older people and be like, wow, they're all in the same general age range, I assume.
yeah, yeah.
Well,
Um,
I'm sure you had me on to talk about just that. It's been a pleasure. Have a good night. Take care. Wonderful talking with you. Glad you got my expertise on how people of a certain age envision everyone older than themselves. But all right.
but no. The second question I have here is, what has helped form your politics over the years as you've gotten older?
Ooh. Ooh. Um, I mean, that's a good question, and it's multi-faceted answer actually. Uh, I would say probably started just once I started becoming a preteen, teenager. I would say 11, 12, probably more like 12, 13. I just really started getting into the news in general. So that got me interested in just what's going on in the world. And then around that same time, I also really started getting into punk music. And that was a huge uh, uh, radicalizer, I guess you can say, in terms of my politics. Uh, but then, of course, also I was in sophomore year of high school, tender age of what, 15, I think it was, when 9/11 happened, and being a New Yorker in Queens and being able to see the building and how different everything became after that. That certainly radicalized me even more. Uh, that definitely pushed me into really like getting into leftist politics and even like more political punk rock music, which then further radicalizes me as well. So it's radicalization on top of radicalization on top of radicalization. And then the final thing, I guess, the cherry on top that pushed me full blown into leftism, I guess you can say, is working at the Majority Report when I did. I jumped in there early 2011. Uh, Interesting story that I'm sure you'll want to know because you'll probably ask me in a little bit. People usually ask me when they want to talk to me about the Majority Report. Sam Cedar found me on Craigslist. He had posted a Craigslist job posting, yes, in early 2011. I was working at the time for like a tech news startup,
Hmm.
and they were just starting to like pivot into like a deal website. And so I was looking to do something else because that really wasn't what I wanted to do. And Sam posted this posting, and what happened was Sam had just set up the podcast. They were doing some test runs. Him, uh, and Dorsey, who was the producer of Air America version of the Majority Report, and a guy named Evan who helped them produce too. And Dorsey was leaving for BuzzFeed, and Sam needed someone to he needed 3 people, himself and 2 producers. And I replied, I met Sam, and history was written. He hired me, and that's that. I was working for the Majority Report.
All right, that's cool. Um, Looks like you already answered half of my next
All
question.
right, I had a feeling.
So, so, um, uh,
I do this too, so I know where you're going.
so what was it like being on a progressive YouTube show slash podcast back then when very few people were doing that?
was it was really cool, first of all, like you said, because no one else was really doing it. Like very few people were doing it, and I don't know. I sort of felt like well, let me tell you this: knowing what I know now, I feel incredibly dumb for not starting my own thing way back then. I could have built up my own audience over the many, many years I was doing it for the Majority Report as well. Alas, as we all know, I did not. But it was it was really cool because we were doing things that, right now I'm basically talking to you through Skype, and you're recording this through Skype. Skype existed then, but you could not record it through Skype then. Like it wasn't built
Yeah.
into Skype. Also, I am using a virtual camera that's allowing me to use a green screen right now. So you're seeing a camera feed that already has the chroma key, in action. So you're not seeing my green screen. Um, that was not a possibility because this program I'm using did not exist. Um, I don't think the Blue Yeti, which I'm using to talk to you, existed. I'm not sure what mic you're using, but
It's my
probably
headphones.
right. Yeah, probably. Well, your headphones existed then, but
Yeah.
probably not as small as they are right now.
Yeah.
Um, it was a lot of people use various programs to stream and there wasn't, back when we were recording, we were streaming actually, the major live stream channels were Ustream and livestream.com, and those don't even exist in that form anymore. One doesn't exist at all. Oh, and Justin TV. Right, right. One doesn't exist at all. Um, one is like an enterprise platform, and Justin TV became Twitch, pretty much.
Hmm.
So that's how different that landscape is. I mean, YouTube's still doing YouTube, but their live stream platform is completely different now. I'm not even sure we were live streaming with YouTube at the beginning. I think we were just clipping the recorded version of the show we were doing and putting that on YouTube because I'm not sure if YouTube had a full blown like live stream platform out yet. Don't quote me on that one, but pretty sure. I mean, it was certainly a lot different, but I'm also pretty sure live streaming capabilities weren't rolled out to everyone at the very least. So yeah, things were a lot different. I mean, not everyone who wanted to start a podcast or a YouTube live stream show was able to do it as easily as they are now. I'm an old man, remember?
Yeah, like for me, I didn't even get involved like when I was like in middle school and high school, which is '09 to 2016, I wasn't on the internet much at all. Like at my house, we had dial up. I'm sure you know what dial up is because you're an
Yeah,
old man.
yeah.
Um but like I didn't go on YouTube ever hardly at all or anything like that. If I ever used the internet at home, it was just like to look up stuff on Wikipedia or news articles or whatever.
Right,
'Cause that's all I could really do. And then if
right,
I ever watched YouTube, it had to be wherever I had Wi-Fi, and I had to use my iPod. I think I got a cell phone my junior year of high school. So like that like my boomer parents kept me from technology for the vast majority of my life. Which I kind of thank them for that because I'm kind of glad I wasn't on the internet whenever I was that age. But it's kind of made me resistant to technology even in these years in my life where it's kind of all we use nowadays for things. But but no, I didn't even find like whenever I watched like progressive news shows, it was always on Free Speech TV or something like that. So like Tom Hartman and stuff like that. I didn't find a Majority Report until like 2016, 2017, whenever I went to college and was able to use Wi-Fi more often and whatnot. And
So damn,
that
you weren't even watching when I was on the show. I was
no,
long
like
gone
exactly. Like
when you
I
found it.
yeah, like when I started getting into Majority Report, and then I started watching the libertarian debates, like the playlist that they have with the Sam versus libertarians. Like I've watched that playlist probably 100 times. So that's how I found out you used to be on the show, was through that. And watching those old clips. And so yeah, and I've seen quite a few of the older episodes, because a lot of those are posted up there on the YouTube channel.
Right.
That's how I've gotten to know a little bit more about the show as a whole, outside of just me watching it for the last 3 years. But yeah, I didn't know that a lot of these different things existed. I didn't really know what a podcast was until I think I was like 2014, 2015, because I was listening to like Jamie Josta, lead singer of Hatebreed. He has a podcast, so I knew what they were, but like I wasn't really that into it like I am now.
Right.
And because I didn't really know much about technology. So
No, I think even the internet as a whole was a lot different pre like what 2014,
yeah,
2015. Like I think a lot of things really changed around that time. If you think back to 2011, 2012 when I'm on the just starting the Majority Part 2011, Occupy Wall Street happened, so we're down there doing that. All the technology we're using is so different. They were iPhones, but like I said, like the platforms were completely different.
yeah,
There's a lot of live stream footage from that era, from protests and stuff like that, that are probably lost for good because it was streamed on a platform like Ustream, which was like the main live stream platform then.
and I don't even know what that is now. Like I
Right.
know, like yeah, that's so old. Like
Like there
I
was
yeah,
I remember having to, pull clips for the Majority Report, and nowadays there's probably like 50 different programs where you just like basically copy and paste a YouTube video and you press a button and the whole thing gets downloaded. I would have to back then it wasn't that easy, and for live stream footage it's even harder to pull because there was no finalized, uploaded like MP4 clip for you to just pull from like the website. It was live stream footage, so I would have to screen record and record the audio simultaneously just to pull like a live streamed clip from one of these older platforms. Things are so different now, it's crazy.
yeah. Like I remember when I was in middle school, that's when Facebook and Twitter started to take off, and MySpace was still a thing. And I wasn't on like any of these sites at the time, so like I just heard about the gossip and drama that used to happen on them, like secondhand from people, and not know what they were talking about. Like I
Right.
don't know what this is. And
Right.
it's funny when I hear people talk about MySpace, how it's dead, and I'm just like I barely even know what that is, but like I know what it is.
That's really
And
funny because
like
for me MySpace was a major part of my teen years.
mhm,
I mean, I was in high school when the MySpace era was at its peak. I was on that. All my friends were on that. You would socialize every day on that, continue conversations and whatever was happening in school on MySpace. At the time, I was in a punk band with a bunch of friends, and we had the band MySpace page up with all of our music uploaded there, and we got a lot of shows from the connections we were making on there. It was like a huge part of those years for me. So it's crazy, just like, yeah, we're like, 10-year difference, you and I, but I'm sure there are people who are in their mid 20s, later 20s, maybe I just have like a 5 or 6 year difference with them, and
yeah.
they were never on MySpace either. It's
Mhm.
crazy how much things changed. But now that, sites like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube are sticking around, that's going to be an experience I think less people have because everyone's going to be on these sites that will continue to exist. So no one's going to
Yeah.
be like, man, remember when this site existed? Well, no, Facebook, I'm going to talk to you about Facebook in 5 years. Just like, and you'll be able to talk to people who are 10 years younger than you about Facebook in 5 years, and there'll probably be no difference other than, "Oh, I remember before this feature existed," or something stupid like
Yeah,
that, but not like a complete platform like
yeah.
falling or something.
Yeah, because that's the thing. Like Loudwire and some of those rock publications, they'll put out a list of 15 bands that made it big because they were on MySpace, and it'll be a whole bunch of like deathcore and metalcore bands from like the mid to late 2000s and stuff. And I'm like, oh,
Right.
that's so cool. Like that never happens on like Facebook now. Like you don't get big because you were on Facebook, because it's not really a place where you know because what is it? You could upload your music to MySpace and stuff like that, and then there was the listings people had and all that kind of stuff. I don't know, like MySpace sounds cool. Like I hearing about it secondhand from people who were on there at the time.
That's a really good point. I mean, I've thought that about that myself too, but hearing it from you, who's there's a big 10-year age gap that you see that too is really interesting to me because yeah, Facebook never really reached out to that audience. Like MySpace, yeah, there were the personal profiles which were really big, but also there were the whole music niche on MySpace was its own thing. Like MySpace was for music really. And Facebook never really cared to cater to that audience. And Facebook never really gave bands or musical artists any real sort of platform on there. Like, yeah, they could create a page or whatever, but it wasn't the same. They weren't able to like upload their music directly. I don't know how it is now. I'm not in a band right now, but in that era where MySpace went down and Facebook took over, there was no easy solution for bands wanting to connect with fans through Facebook. And I wonder how much of certain music scenes their reliance on MySpace and then Facebook's basically ignoring them when Facebook became the platform that took over. I wonder how much those particular music scenes took a hit and never fully recovered. Like,
Well, I would
come
say
to think
for
about it, a
when it
lot
comes,
of the.
go ahead.
No, continue. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, well, like what I was saying was is like when it comes to like heavy metal music, like the last era of like any kind of heavy metal bands that you could consider to be like mainstream in any kind of way, that's that era. They got a lot of those bands got big for MySpace, like Bring Me the Horizon, Suicide Silence, Whitechapel, those kinds of bands. And there you cannot point to any bands like that in any analogous way over the last 10 or so years that made it big like those bands did, especially if you're just going to talk about Bring Me the Horizon. Like they're fucking huge now compared to what they used to be 10 years ago. I mean, they've changed their sound and everything, but like, they got their first start on from like, MySpace and whatnot, and Suicide
That's
Silence, all those kinds of bands. And whenever it comes to heavy metal, that was what had those bands go on, because they also had Headbangers Ball at the time. But without the internet being able to have those kinds of like major platforms to push them, that kind of killed metal in a lot of ways over the last 10 years.
that's the same thing that I think happened to punk rock. That's the same thing I think happened to hardcore. It's the same
Yeah,
thing that happened to a lot of those like emo bands and screamo bands, like the
yeah,
the legit ones, like not like, there's a lot of those, basically boy bands with guitars that still are big. Not
yeah,
talking about those bands.
yeah,
And all the subgenres of those genres too, like pop punk, like real pop punk took a hit too. Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that a lot of that those genres of music that absolutely depend on uh you know independent music, like these are genres that don't necessarily usually hit the mainstream, but they usually have enough bands that get big enough in their own scenes that they can sustain a living.
hmm
I think a lot of those genres of music took a huge hit. And I think a lot of them have never, I don't think those genres ever were anywhere near successful ever again. Sure, you have a band every now and then that comes out and crosses over for a short time. But as a whole scene, I really do think there's a point there that when MySpace went down, all those scenes took a huge hit they never recovered from.
Yeah, because like now I would say there's some bands that are kind of getting bigger. I don't know if they'll ever get as big as, Bring Me the Horizon or Suicide Silence, but there's bands like Knocked Loose and Code Orange now that are like heavy hardcore type bands, and they're getting kind of big
Well,
and they're
big, big,
interesting
big for their scene
for
though.
their
Like,
scene though, but they're
right,
never gonna be like, they're not gonna hit a top 10 album on Billboard
right.
Top 200 anytime soon, like some of these other bands did back in the day. But like,
Like when you
yeah,
think of all like the legendary artists right now from like the past, I don't know, 10, 20, 30, 40, whatever. It's the era of, radio, when obviously those bands made it big because they got on the radio, you had it mainstream.
yeah,
Obviously there's a whole indie scene during all these time periods too, but but because there are bands in those genres who do hit it mainstream and become like the legendary band in that genre, it helps bring the whole genre up as well. Think about the 90s with like Nirvana bringing up the entire grunge scene pretty much. And then you had all those grunge type bands, make Soundgarden,
yeah,
Alice in Chains, all those bands, not as big as Nirvana, but very well known.
yeah,
And then, during the 90s, you have that whole punk rock uh, uh, resurgence with help from like a lot of the pop punk bands. If you're more punk bands like Rancid and who else?
no
Even
effects,
No
Offspring,
Effects,
Green
right?
Day, yeah,
Offspring, yeah, right. Green Day, and then Blink-182 and all those bands. And again, of course, there's still those few bands hitting it mainstream, but it brings up the entire scene.
hmm
Um, I can't think of any band after the MySpace era in those scenes to get big in that way. And I mean like legendary. I
yeah,
was funny thing is I was just talking a few weeks ago about punk rock specifically, not the MySpace angle, but just I was talking to a guest on the second half of my show where it's just for patrons, and we sort of like just like have like a loose conversation about whatever. Um, we're just talking about punk music, and we just brought up how what was the last big punk band, like one to really hit it on the radio and be mainstream. And we brought up Gaslight Anthem, who a couple of years ago they were touring with Bruce Springsteen.
hmm
But I mean, what happened to them? Where'd they go? They never they got big for that time period, hit a
When
peak,
was this, by the way? I've heard that name, but I can't think of any
right?
songs by them.
Right. And then they dropped off. Exactly.
Um,
Um, you know, with I mean, what's going to happen in like, 20, 30 years? Who's going to be the big bands? Like it's going to be all just those radio rock bands who have been like the only type of rock music to maintain some sort of mainstream appeal. Like we're going to all be seeing Coldplay back in like the Coldplay reunion or whatever.
oh
Like
no, so
the
like
like
like what is it? Because if you looked at the mainstream rock charts, what was it? From they did a cumulative thing of the radio play for the mainstream rock charts of the last decade, and they did like a top 20 or a top 10 of the
oh
songs
yeah,
that were most played.
Imagine
And
Dragons is
all
like
of
seven of them.
no, not that one. We're talking about the mainstream terrestrial radio, not
Uh
alternate, not the hot. That's a different chart. I know what
I
you're
ruined
talking
it
about,
for you. I'm sorry.
but like it was the mainstream rock charts, and it was they all the songs that were in the top 10 were songs that came out in like the 90s. They were all like Nirvana and Alice in Chains and stuff like
I
that. And so like and it made me think about how if I turn on the rock station, local rock station in Oklahoma City, I won't hear very much new music. And to the extent that I might hear a new song, it'll be by a band that's at least 10 or 13 years old. Like they'll
right.
play the new Five Finger Death Punch for a few days or for a few weeks or whatever, or they'll play the new Seether, they'll play the new Shinedown, but they're not gonna play. They're not gonna keep.
All bands I don't like,
But they
but
won't
continue.
keep. But like they won't keep them in rotation. And then to the extent that they ever do keep any of these newer songs in rotation, they're from older bands,
Right.
right? And it's like, and I'm like, well, there are new bands coming out. There's new bands that exist. How come they're not playing them? And then they might, but then they won't keep them in rotations. Therefore, the majority of the songs you'll hear in a week will be like from like 2002 or something. Like I hear The Red by Chevelle get played probably like 4 or 5 times in a week, and that song's damn near 20 years old. But I won't hear a new song by whatever the modern day equivalent to Chevelle might be, some sort of radio metal, radio rock type band. So it's like, it's the same kind of thing. And even like the classic rock stations, they have made it to where it's almost like that too now, where you hear a bunch of 90s stuff and they start to leak in some 2000s rock in there. So like, you'll hear Stained now on classic rock stations. And Stained's not a classic rock band, but now, since it's been forever, they'll add them to that. And it's just like, I don't get it. Like, you kind of hear the same things on the new rock stations and then the old rock stations, and it's kind of just like, what happened?
All right. I mean, to be fair, Stained actually to me, I think fits more on those classic rock stations. I mean, what is classic rock? I'm assuming, like, when we're growing up, we think of classic rock as, the Rolling Stones, the Who, even like REM.
Yeah.
But as time goes on, I think more of those bands become classic rock,
Yeah.
because they become older. I think the problem is on the other end, why are they playing? I mean, the music from the 90s on new rock stations. Like, I mean, obviously you play it once in a while because you're that's what they would do with like the Rolling Stones, but they would also mix in the new stuff. The rock music, is I mean, I was never a fan of generic rock music. But rock music as a whole, which includes the subgenres I am fans of, like hardcore and punk, it's dead. It really is. It pains me to say it, but it's dead. I mean, when I was, and this isn't just me being out of touch, because, I mean, when I was growing up, there was a lot of bands, even among my friends. Everyone was in a band. It's not just me not knowing that kids in high school and college and younger in their 20s are in bands. I mean, they are, some of them, but nowhere near the number of bands when I was growing up, because different music has sort of taken over for rock, and so different music doesn't really require bands. And so, I'm not complaining. I think, I think it's great actually that you can make music without having a band. One person could do everything. I think that's awesome. That it's easier to do that now than it was before. But at the same time, it's still possible to do the genres that we like in that style. But I mean, why do that if you know you have all this talent and you're not gonna be successful because there is no market for it anymore. I mean, it sucks, but that's the case. I mean, obviously there'll always be bands in those genres that find a way to make it work. And yeah, that's awesome. And those are the bands I like. But in terms of like this just being a scene, and there's like 100 bands that all sound the same, but they all have a place because people will go see them when they tour or release music. I don't think that's the case anymore with the particular genre of rock and all its subgenres. I think if you want to make a living doing that type of music, you need to be a specific standout in some way. It doesn't mean you make pop music or you're radio friendly. Just you find a niche by doing something different. You get your little specific audience of, a couple thousand, 10,000 people at the very least, and that will sustain you. But, I remember you should look at all the punk bands that ever existed. There's like 1,000 of them that probably all sound the exact same, yet they would all tour and you get excited because they all made a little name for themselves touring and just releasing music. But if they don't stand out now, I feel like there's not an audience for them. And it sucks it's like that, because I miss the scene where there was always shows and the bands always had a place to play. I mean, my band in just the mid 2000s we're playing pretty much every weekend, one or two shows just in New York. That doesn't exist anymore. I'd be shocked if you could find shows like that I mean, and those are just shows we were playing. So that means think about all the shows we weren't playing. So there were shows every day, without a doubt. I doubt that's happening in New York anymore with that specific genre of like punk and hardcore and all that stuff.
Yeah. Let me see here. Kind of got a little off topic. I'm not
Yeah,
even
sure that's how I roll. Off topic.
That was a good conversation though.
Another thing is New York specific though, and you might not notice this as much, which might make it easier for there to be like a local rock scene where you are, but all the small and medium-sized venues in New York closed
Yeah.
because it's unsustainable in this real estate market. All that we really have left are big venues. Um, there's still bars that will let bands play if they but there's no they're small bars. You could fit maybe 50, 60 people really if you pack it in and maybe 100 if you don't care about being over capacity and getting in trouble if it happens, which I was part of many of those type of shows. But also at that time though, like I was under the age under the age of 21. And there were times where we went in and we played the show and had to leave. There were times where we weren't allowed to play certain shows. And I'm assuming now that there is less leniency even because it's harder for these venues even to stay open, these even smaller bars and stuff. I bet if I was in under 21 and in a band nowadays, I bet a New York City bar, one of the few venues that still would allow that type of music, probably wouldn't even let us go in to play because they wouldn't want to deal with the hassle of cops showing up. So like in New York City, it's like even worse when it comes to a local punk or hardcore scene.
Hmm. All right. Let me see.
With
Okay,
all with all
so
with all with all the music talk that you and me have already done on Twitter, you didn't think this show was gonna end up falling into this wormhole here? We were totally gonna end up
I
talking about
did.
music.
I did. I just thought it was gonna be later because I have that later on here, and I'm
Well,
not
this
even
is
sure if this
pre-recorded.
is
You could
out
always
yet.
edit it. You could always
Oh,
throw this on the back.
yeah. So, another question I have here is, so you have this thing where you have an interest in like these obscure weird things on the right, where like you were hip to someone like Mike Cernovich before everyone else was, and you were aware of the QAnon thing before other people were as well. Like, what is your interest in those things, and stuff like that. And could you explain to me what QAnon is?
Right. All right. Well, let's start, I guess, with the first half of your question.
Yeah.
I don't know. The far right has always been really interesting to me. Like, uh, as everyone when they're young and they're 20, growing up in like the internet era of Twitter, being available to you and all the politics talk on there. The early uh, 2010s, I'm on there, and it's fun to dunk on Republicans. And then, as someone who's working on the majority report, you really are paying attention to all the stuff that's going on. And you just dive further into it and you end up uncovering all the different, sort of like we were talking about with music, different subgenres. And a lot of political ideologies have various subset groups, and they all believe different things. So there might be some overlapping. There might be a lot of overlapping. There might be Venn diagrams that are just a complete circle. There might be Venn diagrams where there's just a little crossover at the very edge of the two circles. But they're all sort of in this over like this larger group of right wing politics, and I was just fascinated by the men's rights people during the men's rights movement when they were at their peak. The men going their own way, who sounds like they're men's rights guys, but they're not. They're slightly different. Basically, men going their own way have completely uh, basically turned away from women in their lives. I guess sort of like they were the precursor to incels in a way, sort of. There's still a little bit of a difference there, but for the most part, I think you could see the trajectory. You become a men's rights activist because your wife left you and you have to pay alimony and you're upset about that because the court systems are against you as a man and that really bothers you. I mean, of course, they are that way for a reason and because a lot of the times it does turn out that the overwhelming majority of cases that the man ended up doing something. Domestic violence happens to both men and women, but if you look at the statistics, it's mostly women. So obviously, this isn't just people pulling out pulling shit out of their ass to be misandrists or something. Uh, so I was really into that stuff because it was so weird to me. It was so baffling to me as like a a young leftist at the time, really like becoming further and further to the left, and then I got into from there you sort of, because these guys are sort of like, there's a very popular men's rights subreddit, and that was in those that era of Reddit. It was actually probably one of the more popular ones. It got a lot of attention. And then when you sort of delve into these larger subreddits and dwell on them, you discover again the subgenres, or where they branch out to, which is you know brother, like sibling movements, but they are sort of different. Like for example, white supremacist movement, and from there, I think I'm jumping a bit, but I think the next thing to really get to, because I don't think you have like 5 hours, is Gamergate, and how that was sort of a jump off for sort of the modern reactionary movement. Because really, all these sort of right wing movements are reactionary. They are basically responding to a cultural uh, change, a progressive movement that to them is sort of against whatever they stand for, and they feel like they need to fight back. They usually feel like there's some sort of silent majority who sides with them, but they are the martyrs who need to stand up, who are the only ones brave enough to stand up for everyone else's rights. And that's really the only reason why there's only so few of them, because all the others, the millions of others who stand beside them, are too scared. Of course, we know that's bullshit, but I think that informs why they're so loud, and why they do a lot of the things they do. Another aspect of it is usually the loudest. These dying movements are usually the loudest because they sense that they're on their way out, and they're tooth and nail fighting to preserve whatever they can. But Gamergate was sort of the jump off to the modern right wing reactionary movements. And it was so stupid, really so stupid, because it was a movement that was built on pretty much a very personal grudge. It was built on a personal harassment campaign against a young woman who literally just threw together like I don't want to say throw together because it makes it sound like she didn't do any work, but she put together a text-based game that got a lot of attention because it was truly original and different for the time, and she got this attention. And around the same time, her ex-boyfriend decided to air their dirty laundry and accuse her of cheating with video game reviewers who had covered her game, but there was, I mean, it was connected to a personal beef, and then B, there was no connection to them covering the game because some of them didn't even have any connection to her to begin with. Like this guy was just speculating or whatever. And the ones that did know her, we're talking about like her game was on a list of like, was one game on a list of like the 50 top indie games of the year or something like that. It wasn't like they gave her a whole feature or something. Anyway, I mean, it's even ridiculous to get that specific about it. It's stupid that she was harassed over any of this to begin with. And it's even dumber that an entire movement came out of it. So basically, when it became clear that this was not going to go over with the mainstream because it was a very pointed attack on a single individual, the people who were pushing this attack on her tried to push it into a broader movement that was really fighting for ethics in video game journalism. They tried to push it from a harassment campaign against. Now, remember, this campaign was literally called. It had a name, a stupid name. I mean, it's even worth saying. It was called like Five Guys Burgers and Fries, and it was a reference to one of the puns that were used against her because they were like five video game reviewers that apparently she was hooking up with to get coverage, which again, bullshit, didn't happen. And that's why it was the pun or whatever, or some stupid shit like that. That was literally the name of this harassment campaign. And it was contorted into Gamergate because they wanted to make it into an actual movement. I'm sorry, you can't build an actual legitimate movement off of a very targeted harassment campaign against a woman for doing nothing wrong.
So
Um,
that's what that was about?
right. Yes,
Okay, because
that's
I've heard
literally
about this so many times and have looked into this and never really understood what it was like about or anything. I just remember everyone always saying like, "Oh, it was about ethics in gaming journalism" as a joke. So I knew that wasn't really it, but I never
like
knew what it actually was
that's
surrounded. Yeah,
that's why it's a joke
yeah,
because I mean it's a multifaceted joke because the idea of ethics in gaming journalism, it sounds like the dumbest thing. I mean, first of all, like the idea like there is great gaming outlets and there are journalists who cover video games. But I mean, what is gaming journalism? I mean, if you're covering video games, in my view, I mean, you're really covering the business of games.
yeah.
And if you are talking about just games, not the game business, you're usually doing a video game review. So you're a game reviewer or a journalist that covers the business of video games. I don't know what gaming
Gaming
journalism is.
journalism.
Like what is gaming journalism? Um, so I mean, it's just, and the idea that there'd be a movement for ethics in it is just ridiculous. But then, but then the
I'm
I mean,
sorry, it's just too
I
funny.
mean, right. I mean, when you bring that up to them, they'd go, "Oh, so you don't like ethics?" No, obviously, I'm a fucking journalist myself. Of course, ethics are important, but why not fight for the broader? I mean, if you really have an issue with ethics in gaming journalism, why not fight for the broader aspect and fight for just ethics
Ethics
in
in
journalism?
journalism.
Right.
Yeah.
But also it's bullshit because, and the reason it's one of the other reasons it's a joke, it's because they didn't really, it wasn't about ethics in gaming journalism. It was about wanting to harass. If it was started out with wanting to really make sense of them wanting to harass this woman to a broader audience who wouldn't be behind you just attacking this single person for personal beefs. But also, if you really got into what they were complaining about, it was because they were opinion writers or gaming critics who were putting out videos, and one of their biggest foils, one of the people they hated the most, was Anita Sarkeesian, who basically put out this video series that she got funded through Kickstarter, where she basically gave feminist critiques to video games. I mean, this is nothing mind-boggling or brand new. There have been feminist critiques of all literature, films, all art forms had feminist critiques. I mean, it's literally like a thing. It's like just there there's classes, there's a whole like a whole world of it in college where you could take classes about the feminist perspective on things. I mean, this is just a thing that exists. And they had a problem with like her videos being like critiquing one of their favorite games because the for one example, just off the top of my head, I can't remember anything specific, but they would get mad that she would point out how the men are presented as fully clothed and in armor and gear and super muscular, ready to fight battles, but even the female warriors would be wearing these skimpy outfits that would be like showing their cleavage, when like why would you, if you were a woman in battle, you'd be wearing a full-blown army costume outfit just like the men would. That was like her point, and it's a critique of art that happens in all forms, and it makes sense. There's nothing wrong with it. And they took it as like a personal attack on them. They looked at it as like liberals and social justice warriors trying to take over their video game world, and they would act like they were trying to convince like Square or Sony or whatever their favorite video game publishers are to change their games, and they'd be like, just make your own games that way. But like, no one says that about any other art form. There are critiques of paintings. Like there's still like, I bet you could find modern feminist critiques of like a Picasso painting, and no one's like, go paint your own Picasso. Like
Right.
it's just ridiculous. There will be opinions from all forms. Like I let's put it this way. Like I think right wing opinions are ridiculous, but I don't act like a right-wing opinion of media is like they're trying to convince. I mean, maybe actually that's different for right-wingers. They're actually a lot of those family religious groups actually do try to
Yeah, they have
force
their
that
yeah.
shit. Yes. Um, maybe not the best example, but if
Yeah.
there's all sorts of critiques that are basically, I mean, in a way, all these critiques try to push those companies to do better, but they're not forcing them. There's no one holding a gun to any of these companies' heads. At the end of the day, if Nintendo made games with big boobies in them, and those are the games that sold the most for Nintendo, then Nintendo would keep making big booby video games. Like that's what it comes down
Yes.
to. So if a video game company decides that I don't know, their characters are their women characters sell better fully clothed, then they'll actually throw some clothes on those women to make sure that they reach out to that broader audience. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. But these Gamergate people were so angry that there would be these sort of critiques on their video games. And really, that's literally what it was. And from there, you basically had all these targeted harassment campaigns against anyone who dared to critique a video game. And then from there, right winger personalities who were looking for a grift or looking for an easy ticket to fame online, they saw a bunch of angry young white men in Gamergate, and they were like, "Oh, that's the perfect market for us. That's the perfect audience for us. We're going to take advantage of them." And that's where Milo Yiannopoulos became famous from. That's where Mike Cernovich became famous from. There's a whole bunch of grifters that basically used Gamergate as the jump off to make a name for themselves because they started defending these Gamergaters. They made these Gamergaters feel like they were on their side because they really cared about video games. I mean, there were points where Milo Yiannopoulos was just openly shitting on video games and how little he knew about them. But because he defended them against liberals, these Gamergaters had to convince themselves that he was one of them. Um, and through that, they were able to radicalize a lot of these younger guys into right-wing politics and further right politics. And then when it came down to it, super far right politics. And that's really what sort of led to these bigger names having such a force in the lead up to the 2016 election. And which brings us, I guess, to QAnon, which QAnon comes after a couple years after all these movements I just talked about. I mean, actually, probably have to talk about Pizzagate first. Basically, Pizzagate was a far right movement, a conspiracy theory that was sort of being built during the time period right before the November elections in 2016, where a lot of these right wingers and far right people were thinking Trump was going to lose, and this was going to be their way to really focus attention on Hillary. And what I'm talking about is when WikiLeaks released the Podesta emails that were hacked, there was a lot of talk in these emails about ordering pizza. Now, we can go on and on into why this was the case, and we could also critique how much money was spent on pizza from a political campaign. But the end of the day was a lot of campaigns eat a lot of pizza because it's a fast, quick, and easy food that everybody loves. And it's easy to order it in bulk and get it delivered to your campaign office when people are working 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 hours in the lead up to a major national presidential election. But conspiracy theorists and right wingers saw this pizza reference, all these pizza references, and said, no way anyone eats this much pizza. This must be code word for child sex rings. Yes, pedophilia. Literally, they see pizza and they think it's code word for different types of pedophilia, different types of children they like, and other ridiculous things. And that became Pizzagate. And one of the major focal points of Pizzagate was there is a pizza place in DC that's very popular because it's in DC and just has a name for itself there. And I believe the owner is, it's a successful pizza place. And I believe the owner is like not a major, but he's like a fairly successful, Democratic campaign supporter. And the belief was because a lot of this pizza was being ordered from this place, Comet Pizza, there must be a pedophile ring straight out of Comet Pizza. And they decided it must be happening in the basement because obviously where else would a pedophile ring happen? In a basement of a pizza place. There was all this crazy talk, and it all pretty much led to an armed person, like a guy showed up at Comet Pizza with a gun, looking to free the children in the Comet Pizzeria basement. One problem is that Comet Pizzeria doesn't have a basement. It's sort of like the I don't know if you're a fan of Pee Wee Herman, but in Pee Wee's Big Adventure, he's told that his lost bike he's looking for is in the basement of the Alamo. So he travels across the country to get to the Alamo, and he asks the tour guide, "When are we going to go to the basement?" And they all laugh at him because there is no basement in the Alamo. He was lied to. Sort of like this armed guy looking for the basement of Comet Pizzeria. So out of Pizzagate, which still exists in a way, sort of came QAnon. And when I mean like sort of, I mean the same people who pushed Pizzagate moved over to QAnon. And what QAnon to me became is sort of like an incubator for all these conspiracies. 9 times out of 10, when you hear about a new right-wing conspiracy, it became one of the latest rumors or one of the latest drops from Q that sort of manifests into its very own conspiracy. And what QAnon is, it is the belief that Donald Trump is secretly waging a war against the deep state, which is, the FBI, the CIA, the all the facets
The
that have
Pentagon.
existed since the dawn of time of the United States government, that have long-standing reach, and a global pedophile ring, which includes the Democrats, Hollywood celebrities, billionaires, Democratic billionaires, of course, and world leaders, and they believe that pretty much every gaffe that Donald Trump does, every screw up Donald Trump does, spoken or otherwise, is on purpose. It's all part of his plan. A lot of the times they believe he's secretly sending them a message. There is a person or persons. It is not 100% clear, although there have been many different pieces out there that think they've discovered who Q is. Basically, there's a person or persons who go by Q. It started on 4chan. And then 4chan even thought this was crazy. Now, 4chan is the image board that gave life to Gamergate and a lot of the far right stuff. But even 4chan thought this Q stuff was crazy. So when they banned it, they went over to 8chan, which was a even further right spin-off of 4chan. And basically Q is a person or persons who leave these really vague comments, posts that they present as sort of like code words that are part of QAnon, obviously. That's where the Q and QAnon comes from. And this person is believed by the conspiracy theorists who follow him to be working with Donald Trump or in his orbit, or possibly even Donald Trump himself. They're not 100% sure. In their world, not 100% sure who Q is. That basically is working on this big plan and is dropping these hints to keep Donald Trump's biggest fans in the know, as sort of like a wink wink. We want you all to know what's going on. And so that's QAnon. And you can sort of see what I mean by saying it's an incubator for all the craziest conspiracies now, because all Q needs to do is drop one of his vague comments, one of his vague communiques. Then all the different Q followers will get their own readings of it, and they'll believe, one will believe it means this, one will believe it's that, and then spawned from that are, in that example, just 2 new conspiracy theories, just like that. So you could imagine just how this sort of branches out and becomes even crazier. There's all sorts of crazy QAnon conspiracies. Let me pull up one of my favorite ones. I just want to get this guy's name right because it is hilarious. One second. You could edit this part out. One second. I just want to make sure Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this one of the craziest QAnon conspiracies, well, my favorite at least, is the idea that QAnon believes that JFK Jr. is actually alive, that he didn't die, and he's a huge, huge Donald Trump fan, and that he's waiting for the right moment to come out and announce his support of Donald Trump. And why they believe this is because for some reason they think this random Donald Trump supporter named Vinny Fuchsia, I believe his name is they think he looks like John F. Kennedy Jr. And they think he looks like him, and he's secretly JFK Jr. And he's just waiting for the right moment to unveil that he never died. Now, if you actually see a picture of this guy, he looks nothing like JFK Jr. So, I mean, but it'll never die because how can you prove it's not him? Like,
Yeah.
this guy could come out and say that he's not JFK Jr., but of course they'll just say, well, of course you'll say that. You don't want anyone to know you're JFK Jr. I mean, it's really easy to not prove these guys wrong because you can't prove the absence of something. Like, you can't prove that something is not. You can only prove that something is. Like, you can show a QAnon person Vinny Fuchsia's details, like you can let them meet him, and they can still believe he's JFK Jr. Because how do you prove he is not? You can only prove who he is. You can't prove who he isn't. It's so stupid and ridiculous. It's even hard to explain sometimes, but that is generally the core of QAnon.
That's interesting.
It's insane.
How long do these conspiracy theories take in order to make it to Fox News next? Like, how long does that take generally?
I mean, a lot of these things are so insane they really don't even make it to Fox News. I mean, it is. I mean, there's definitely. Listen, what ends up happening, the more general thing that ends up happening is that these QAnon accounts get big, and they end up just being big accounts talking about Donald Trump. Some of their more mainstream tweets or comments end up in the more general right-wing conservative orbits, and that's how you end up with Donald Trump retweeting a crazy QAnon follower. I would say that's the more general thing. A lot of these QAnon people really probably don't even trust Fox News. That's how far gone they are. Really, it's a whole different. Again, there's that. If you were to make like a tree, like a family tree out of it, or like a whatever, like a mind map or whatever. There's the overarching conservatism ideology, and then you have all these subgenres, and then you have like conspiracy theorists as part of these subgenres, and QAnon is its own whole little bubble under all of that. It branches out into probably 1,000 of its own child bubbles.
That's interesting. Let's see. And then the last thing I have here is music. So, who are your favorite bands?
Jeez.
At least give me 5 of them.
All right, let me think. Give me a second to think. All right, 5 of my favorite all-time bands. This probably changes as I rediscover someone, but the bands that have always been part of my favorite. 5 bands that have always been among my favorites. Leftover Crack. The Virus, The Unseen, Against Me, and there's so many I could fit in here. I'm gonna throw in a band that's a little bit different than all those bands. I'm gonna go with Save the Day.
All right.
5 bands I always listen to, always among my favorites. I mean, I'll probably remember the half dozen that swap out every now and then with those during a certain time frame, but those are like bands that have been my consistent always listening to, always always big fans of.
Okay. So do you know the band Helmet?
I'm vaguely familiar with them. I mean, I've heard the name before.
Okay. I was gonna ask if you were ever into them.
No,
Um,
I honestly never really got into any of like the new metal type stuff. I
mhm,
always strongly disliked it. And I always viewed like the more mainstream generic like hard rock bands as part of that, even though I know they're a bit different. I just never really liked like the generic like the rock and roll type of I like rockabilly, I like all that type of music, but I never really liked the harder type generic rock music.
mhm,
Um uh there's certain like metal I like. One of my favorite bands, I don't know if you would consider them metal, Darkest Hour. They were one of
mhm.
my top bands. But you can see why I like them though, because there's a crossover between them and like hardcore and punk. Even like
Yeah.
their vocal style. I like
What about Hatebreed?
Hatebreed. Hatebreed is one of those bands who are in the genre of bands I like, but I never really got too into Hatebreed specifically.
Mhm.
Like a lot of the bands I like probably say Hatebreed's one of their biggest influences.
Yeah.
I mean, I like Sworn Enemy. Are you familiar with Sworn Enemy?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I think Sworn Enemy is great, but again, you could see the difference where Sworn Enemy has more that faster, like punk
Yeah.
rock style with the beatdowns, as opposed to just being like slower beatdown throughout the whole
Yeah.
thing. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. 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 They're
Um,
like the heavy hardcore type stuff,
right,
right?
right.
Yeah.
I can think that's fast. I like things that are melodic. I like a lot of like crust punk stuff,
Mhm.
which has crossover with a lot of that, like like the fast, screamy, like Municipal Waste.
Mhm.
They're one of those crossover bands that seem to be really big with punk, with the punk scene and the metal scene.
Yeah.
Uh,
Have you heard of the band Knocked Loose?
yes, I've heard of them, but I'm not too familiar with them.
Okay, they're pretty good. I've been listening to their second album often. They're pretty great.
Trying to think who else. I'm doing a quick, because of course, whenever I'm asked these questions, I really can't remember. You know what's a crossover genre that we probably both like? Thrash. I mean, that's what Municipal Waste is. They're like a thrash
Yeah,
band. It's like
I
that,
like
like fast
some.
sort of.
I like some thrash bands, but like not so much the big four thrash bands or like the older thrash bands. Like I mean, I like some Metallica, I like some Slayer, some Megadeth. Well, I don't really like Megadeth that much. I like some Anthrax,
I
but
don't know if I'd
like
put them. I don't know if I'd put all those in thrash. The way Metallica to me, just like
I like the old
generic,
school
generic
Metallica,
metal.
like the old school
Yeah,
Metallica, not like the not Black Album and after Metallica, but like Red Lightning, that kind of stuff, Master of Puppets, that kind of stuff.
right. A little
But
bit, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, but when it comes to thrash, like some of the newer thrash bands, like Bullet for My Valentine or Trivium or stuff like that. I like a lot of groove metal, like
Yeah, I never got
Pantera.
into that.
Never got into
I never
that.
got into that. I mean,
Yeah,
there's Pantera songs I like. I
yeah,
mean, as a pro wrestling fan, I think every pro wrestling fan loves Walk because of Rob Van Dam. But I
yeah,
mean, I never
yeah.
really there are a lot of good Pantera songs, but I never really got into them fully.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, as far as like thrash goes, I never really got too much into thrash itself. Um, but then like there's groove metal I like, and that's kind of like one of those genres that's kind of like thrashish, hardcore-ish influenced. Um, let's see here.
Yeah, I never got into groove metal. I think it's a little bit too new metal esque for me.
It's one of those precursors to new metal.
Yeah.
Um, let's see here. Trying to think of some. Yeah, I
I mean,
never really.
I'm looking at some bands that are considered groove metal.
Yeah,
I'm familiar with Lamb of God,
Lamb
and
of
they're
God.
pretty they're,
Yeah,
they're pretty good. But like Devil Driver, Five Finger Death Punch, those bands I never really got into. So
yeah.
I guess Lamb of God might be one of those crossover ones though, where
Yeah.
they sort of fit in the hardcore scene as well, whereas
Mhm.
a group like Five Finger Death Punch doesn't.
Yeah. And then let's see here. Butcher Babies is another one I'm into. It's more like a groove band. Let's see who else. As far as those kind of, did you ever get into metalcore at all?
There were metalcore bands I liked, and I probably went to tons of metalcore shows because at the time there was a real crossover.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, hardcore was going through this resurgence with like the newer hardcore stuff, like Full Blown Chaos, a lot of that really like heavy, like beat down after beat down type stuff. And so if you went to a punk show or even like a hardcore punk show, there were always those heavier like hardcore bands who were on it because they were sort of welcomed into the scene because there was crossover. Metalcore sort of was derivative, I think, from like that stuff, and also in some ways from even like the screamo scene had some metalcore influence as well. So there were definitely bands that I was into. I'm looking at like Atreyu, obviously
Yeah.
I liked them a lot when I was back then. But I don't. But then when I'm looking at these other bands, like As I Lay Dying is in there. But then I'm looking at
Kill,
some of these other bands, and
Killswitch
I don't.
Engage.
Yeah, like I don't think Atreyu and Killswitch Engage are the same. Like I don't know why they're both under metalcore. I don't think they're two different.
Well, like Killswitch Engage is more like melodic metalcore because like it's kind of like a death metal thing where there's melodic death metal and there's death metal. Then with metalcore, there's melodic metal or metalcore, then non-melodic
But
metalcore.
if
So
you
it's like
listen,
that, yeah.
if you listen to Atreyu though, you see a crossover with the sort of like emo and screamo type bands, which is why it always made sense for me that they were part of that scene. But then if
Mhm.
you listen to like the Killswitch Engage stuff, like their vocals are much more in line with like the more like radio friendly metal bands. Like they're not to
Yeah.
me, I don't see how they're both in the same. I can see where there's crossover, but I wouldn't consider both of them metalcore. I mean, there's probably like a subgenre that they each fit in under metalcore, but
Yeah.
I don't think Atreyu and Killswitch Engage are the same music style.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the other bands. See, like whenever I was in high school, there was like the
Like,
metalcore bands that people were into were like Bring Me the Horizon, of Mice and Men. Before they left core entirely, they just became like new metal bands, and then whatever. But then like what else? There was Asking Alexandria,
right,
and I was never really into these bands at all. I mean, I kind of got into Mice and Men as I got older, but not that much. But
right.
let's
Like
see.
I'm looking at like what Wikipedia considers the origins. Like I'm not even talking about they
Yeah,
have the whole like precursor, and obviously like I'm a fan of Agnostic Front, Murphy's
yeah,
Law, those type of bands. They're not they're the precursors. Yes, they like
yeah,
they were influences, but they're not directly.
yeah,
But what they're claiming are the origins of metalcore are bands like Earth Crisis and
yeah.
Converge and Shai Hulud. Those bands to me are in the overarching punk and hardcore scene. But
Hmm.
then you get later on and you see bands like Killswitch Engage and who else is on this list
I'll
here?
probably say Bullet for My
Uh,
Valentine too.
Shadowfall,
Yeah.
uh, Avenged Sevenfold. I
Yeah,
mean,
early Avenged Sevenfold
th-
and
those bands are not part of
yeah.
to me, not part of the overarching like hardcore punk scene.
Hmm.
So like it's to me, there's a big difference in terms of like I guess the later metalcore stuff and then the earlier on metalcore stuff.
Yeah, because what you get, see, because like when you get to the era that I'm a lot that was like popular whenever I was like in high school and middle school, you have a lot of metalcore bands that also mix a lot of like post-hardcore-ish type stuff. Or at least what we call post-hardcore. So people my age, what we call consider post-hardcore is stuff like Sleeping with Sirens and Pierce the Veil, which I know is not at all what like old school post-hardcore would be. But like for like a lot of the like metalcore bands from like 2008 through about 2014 or so, they mixed like metalcore with like that kind of style of music, and I didn't really like that style of music at all. At least I didn't prefer it at all compared to like the older styles of metalcore and stuff like that.
Right. I mean, I'm just looking at what's considered even like post-hardcore, and even that to me is like all over the place. Like,
Right?
I see like bands like Thrice and At the Drive-In are considered post-hardcore, which I agree. Those are post-hardcore bands.
Yeah.
But then I also see like those later bands like Under Oath and like
Yeah,
I
like
don't know,
under yeah. Sleeping
and
with Sirens.
Escape the Fate. I don't
Yeah.
consider them a post-hardcore. Those are much more in line with what I mentioned earlier. Like they're not quite there, but they're to me those bands are the precursor to like the boy bands with the guitars. Like
Yes.
Under Oath is much more precursor to like that type of stuff than in the post-hardcore like genre to me. I don't know. Maybe
Yeah,
I'm
see
just
that's
out of
no, I agree with you because that's what I thought was odd whenever I heard people saying stuff like Sleeping with Sirens and Pierce the Veil was post hardcore. I was like, I don't know, man. Like this doesn't necessarily sound like anything that like I would consider like what would be considered post hardcore 10 or 15 years ago, but
right.
go ahead, I guess. But yeah.
And I
And then
mean
there's this
you could tell because it's just like, I mean, listen to I don't know, Thursday even, who I feel like straddle like the whole like screamo post-hardcore genre. You can see where they fit in, like the style of music, even when you go past the music, just the audiences they appeal to and the type of shows they played. You could
mhm.
definitely see the crossover. But I don't know how many people who are into like hardcore and punk would go to see like Silverstein or something like that. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that to me is like a completely different genre. I mean, you want to argue that they are under a much broader punk hardcore umbrella, that's fine. But I would like put it like way, way away from all those other bands that are in the post-hardcore genre.
Yeah, cause what was it? Because what is a post-hardcore band like? Fugazi's post-hardcore, correct?
Yeah, I would say that they're probably there as one of like the originals.
Yeah, like I
Uh,
listened to
like
that, and then I listened to something like Sleeping with Sirens or Percivella, and I don't see any kind of similarities between the two. Yeah.
right. I think a lot of times I think a lot of these later bands are fans of those bands and they listen to a lot of them and they sort of spark the influence, but then they end up creating their own style.
Hmm.
And then and I think they still want to be part of that scene, even though they're not,
Hmm.
based on the style of music they're playing. So I think that's probably how that ends up happening.
Yeah, probably because like I remember someone was doing this video about some of these bands, and they were talking about how like they're not their whole style and aesthetic is not derivative of any kind of like hardcore scene. And if you ask them what their musical influences are, a lot of them will tell you like something like Linkin Park or something like that.
Right.
And it's like oh okay, I see. And that's why like it they didn't really gel well with the original people who were involved in the hardcore scenes back in the day.
Right. Like to me, like there are bands that are stuck in between. Like let me give you an example. Like to me, pop punk are band like real pop punk is bands like The Descendants and Dillinger Four, groups like that. And then you have like the more mainstream radio friendly bands. So I still consider pop punk, especially their older stuff, are definitely pop punk. But I even still consider like, bands like Blink 182 is a pop punk band.
Hmm.
Even though later on but still you can even in their later stuff you can sense the pop punk influence underneath. I consider them part of that overarching umbrella. But I wouldn't even put Blink 182 in the same group as like, I don't know, All American Rejects. Like to me, All
Yeah,
American Rejects is an
that's
example
alternative.
of
That is that is
that's
a
what
yeah,
that's what I was telling you about before. Like they're a boy band with guitars.
yeah.
I don't see any of the pop punk influence in any of it. Like maybe they were influenced directly, not the style of music, but maybe they grew up listening to Blink 182 and they want to play that type of music, but they're
Hmm.
not.
Yeah.
It's completely different.
Yeah. How do you feel about All Time Low?
Yeah, they're to me boy bands with guitars.
Yeah, like most people my age consider them to just be pop punk.
They're not. They're not. They're
Like,
even
yeah,
Blink 182 doesn't even deserve to be put in the same category as them. They're not. They're
yeah,
absolutely not.
yeah. Like that was the kind of stuff I couldn't really get into, and I was just, and everyone was just so into that whenever
See,
I
that's the
listened.
problem. Maybe you don't realize you like the music that you because I think perhaps your age range has the wrong idea. Look up. My favorite pop punk band is probably Dillinger Four. Look up
Hmm.
Dillinger Four if you're not familiar with them. That's like real pop punk music to me, and I think you'll probably It's not gonna be your favorite band, judging on what you like from what you're telling me your bands are. But I think you'll be like, oh, okay, I could totally get why people like this stuff.
Yeah.
Way more than you'll listen to All Time Low and get it. Like
Yeah. Like
it's
I
not the same at
remember,
all.
yeah, like when I was like the summer before I got to be in high school, I really liked Green Day's Dookie album. Like I used to play that all the time on repeat. And that was like as far as I ever really got into like punk music remotely. I think I bought
Like
some more Green Day CDs, but outside of that, like I never really got too much into it.
I never really got into Green Day. They have some good songs, yes. Never really got into them. Actually think, I actually think they're pop punk because of their status in the scene,
Yeah.
more so than their actual music, to be honest.
Hmm.
I think they're one of the they were there early on, and they were part of the scene because they were there. They were playing on the shows that the other bands that actually were playing the legit pop punk style music were playing. But if you compare Blink-182 to the majority of those pop punk bands that they came up with, they don't sound like that.
Hmm.
So I consider them part of that scene because of who they are. But I think if you compare just their music style, they're much more in line with just like, you know, fast rock music, really, to me, in my opinion. I mean, I never really felt like their style of music was the equivalent to those other pop punk bands.
How do you feel about Falling in Reverse? Do you know anything about them?
No, I'm not familiar with them at all.
Okay, cool. Well, anyway, that's all I had here to talk about. It's been great. It's been fun. Where can we find you on social media? And where can
Oh,
we find your podcast?
well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me. It's been tons of fun to talk about things that I normally talk about, which is the crazy conspiracy theory and right wing stuff. But it was very fun talking about stuff I don't usually talk about on other shows, like this music conversation we had. So thanks for having me on. Uh, People can find me on Twitter at Matt Binder, MattBinder. You could also subscribe to my YouTube channel where I live stream my show every week, sometimes multiple times a week, at youtube.com/Matt Binder. If you want just the podcast version of my show, Doomed with Matt Binder, you can find that at doomedpod.com. I also have a Patreon page where you can support uh, my work if you'd like financially at patreon.com/Matt Binder. And yeah, that's pretty much the main channels you can find me and my show.
All right. Thanks for coming on, man.
My pleasure.